Good evening, and welcome to those joining us here in the members room and those joining us in the live stream. I am Sarah Elliott Holliday from the library's event staff, and I'm just up here momentarily to say a word about tonight's speaker, Aaron L Thompson. If you're here tonight, I expect you, like me, have asked some big questions in the last few years about public monuments, historical memory, and contemporary society. Now more than ever, a wider range of voices and perspectives have come on the public stage, and we've seen protests such as Bree Newsom's removal of the Confederate flag at the South Carolina State House in 2015, that one stuck in my head particularly, or the 2020 toppling of the DC statue of Confederate officer Albert Pike. Fortunately, we have with us the country's leading expert in the tangled aesthetic, legal, political, and social issues reflected in these big questions. Dr. Erin L Thompson is America's only professor of art crime and is associate professor of fraud, forensics, art law, and crime at John Jay College, CUNY. She holds both a PhD in ancient Greek, Roman, and ancient Near Eastern art history from Columbia and a JD. She studies the black market for looted antiquities, art forgery, museum theft, the ethics of digital reproductions of cultural heritage, art made by detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and a variety of other overlaps between art and crime, and is also a member of the advisory committee for the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign. In addition to her new book, Smashing Statues, which by the way, we do have for sale just outside this room, she is the author of Possession, The Curious History of Private Collectors from Antiquity to the Present. Her writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, Hyperallergic, Bitch, and Art in America. Please join me in welcoming Erin L Thompson.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here. And I know you probably came expecting me to read from my book, but whenever I go to a reading and then I think this is great and I buy the book afterwards and then I can't come to the part where the author read it, I always feel a little bit cheated. Like, I already heard this, why am I paying for this? So instead, I'm going to talk to you about what's been happening with one of the monuments I write about in the book since the book was finished, the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was too lazy to have pictures, so he's on a horse. Don't worry, I think you'll get a pretty good idea of my writing style, but you'll also get to hear about a fight that is still very much happening. So in 2016, a high school freshman petitioned Charlottesville City Council to take down a bronze equestrian statue of General Lee from its pedestal in a park in the city's historic center. I am offended every time I pass it, she had written. I am reminded over and over again of the pain of my ancestors. After a long series of debates and public meetings, the city council voted not to remove, but to relocate the monument to a less prominent location. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Monument Fund, a new organization dedicated to protecting Charlottesville statues, the Lee in particular, immediately sued. Under Virginia state law, municipal authorities could not disturb or interfere with any monuments or memorials. The city argued that the law did not apply to their monuments, these monuments in particular, but a judge issued a preliminary injunction, which meant that Lee had to stay in place while the lawsuit made its way through the courts. Meanwhile, white supremacist groups organized a large rally for August 2017, dubbing it Unite the Right. The Lee Monument, as one of the rally's leaders explained, was the focal point of everything, because removing it would be white genocide. It's about the replacement of our people, culturally and ethnically. Clashes between white supremacists and counter-protesters meant that Virginia's governor declared a state of emergency before the rally even began. As the crowd slowly dispersed, a white nationalist drove his car through a group of counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, an anti-racist activist, and injuring dozens of others. Charlottesville's mayor ordered the Lee Monument shrouded in black tarps to mourn Heyer's death. After the Monument Fund plaintiffs complained that the public's right to view the statue was obstructed by giant trash bags, the judge ordered the shroud removed. In July 2020, new state law went into effect in Virginia, allowing its municipalities to make their own decisions about what monuments they would display. But the ongoing Monument Fund lawsuit meant that Lee still stood in Charlottesville. In April 2021, the Virginia Supreme Court finally ruled that Charlottesville could do what it wanted with its Lee, and after hours of testimony from the public at a Zoom hearing in June 7, 2021, the City Council voted to finally remove it. The arguments that day didn't really have to do a lot with removal, which seemed a foregone conclusion, but what should happen next? Where should Lee go after he left his pedestal? What should happen to other controversial monuments in the same situation? The question was all the more important because the great majority of monuments taken down since the death of George Floyd in 2020 remain in storage with their ultimate fate in question. No Confederate monuments have yet been destroyed or otherwise permanently, irrevocably removed from display. At the June 2021 hearing, Don Gathers, a co-founder of Charlottesville Black Lives Matters, described the Lee statue as a, quote, bat signal for white supremacists. Arguing that it would attract violence wherever it is placed, Gathers suggested instead melting it down. Have someone transform it into a rainbow, he proposed, and listen to white supremacists' head explode immediately afterwards. Gathers was far from the only one asking for total destruction of the Lee Monument. How many have melted down their idols of war and turned them into symbols of justice? Another caller asked. This country doesn't need any more bronze generals and horses. It needs monuments forged from their remains. Another speaker pleaded with the council not to let monuments become someone's perverse trophies of not only our city's trauma, but the trauma of generations of people of color. An activist who was stabbed in the stomach with a flagpole during the Unite the Right rally suggested that the metal from the statue be recast into commemorative coins to be distributed as souvenirs for everyone who helped take them down. These proposals to melt down monuments and turn them into something more fit for the country we hope to have in the future might seem radical. But in fact, Americans melted down the very first metal monument to arrive here. New York City's lead statue of George III was turned into bullets in 1776 to fight the King's Own troops during the Revolutionary War. Throughout history, public monuments have fallen whenever regimes change or whenever people decide they no longer want to honor the ideologies enshrined in those statues. For instance, triumphal 1945 newsreel footage shows the Allies blowing up a giant swastika that had loomed over a Nuremberg stadium. Rejecting a cruel history by attacking its monuments is so important that after Koreans removed public statues of a disgraced former president, they put one back up so its citizens could break it all over again. Often such monuments are simply smashed for scrap, but sometimes they're transformed. Some Soviet monuments were recast as sculptures of Olympians or poets. One Ukrainian Lenin got a cloak and became Darth Vader, beaming out free Wi-Fi from his helmet. Despite this long history, many Americans don't agree that destruction or transformation should be options for our controversial monuments. Quite the reverse. There have been concerted opposition to the idea of relocating or even adding contextualizing signage to many monuments. If we're not melting down Confederate monuments as enthusiastically as we blew up swastikas or Stalins, it's because I think the Civil War is not yet truly over. The dispute at its heart about the proper relationships between Americans of different heritages still rages on. Ironically, the transformative possibilities of molten metal were part of the original plan for Charlottesville Lee statue. After making his fortune as a stockbroker, Paul Goodloe McIntyre gave many gifts to his hometown, including the Lee and another monument of Stonewall Jackson. In 1917, McIntyre commissioned the Lee statue from a New York sculptor who proposed casting the general from melted down Confederate cannons. That part of the plan didn't happen. There weren't enough cannons available, apparently. The sculptor died and the project was taken over by another artist whose finished work has been regarded as awkward and unrealistic. As early as 1923, when Virginia newspapers ran photographs of the final model for the sculpture, an indignant letter to the editor from a Confederate veteran complained that the sculptor not only signally failed to reproduce General Lee as he actually was, but that the monument's restless horse bore no resemblance to Lee's famed Mount Traveler, who was not a horse to put on airs. Many people worry that relocating or otherwise removing monuments will erase history, including then President Trump, who tweeted a few days after the Unite the Right rally that it was sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart by the removal of monuments, calling it foolish to lose the chance to learn from history. I don't think that removing a monument, which after all is a single source of information, puts us in danger of erasing whole swaths of history, but it's worth taking this argument seriously enough to ask what history it was exactly that a monument like the Charlottesville Lee taught, and what history did it hide. So I want you to imagine yourself on a street corner in Richmond, Virginia, on a summer day in 1923, walking past a man named John Powell, his pale eyes alert in his long, narrow face. In an essay Powell later published titled, "Is White America to Become a Negroid Nation?" he described on this day counting among the passerbys over 200 Negroes, of whom only 5 were Black. He also recorded over 30 individuals of whom I could not with any degree of certainty state whether they were white or colored. In a manner echoing contemporary panics about trans and gender nonconforming people going undetected in the wrong bathrooms or sports teams, many white Virginians in the early 1920s were convinced that the color line was eroding. How could they enforce segregation if some Black people could pass for white? Powell and his allies, eager to find justifications for the continued denial of political participation, economic opportunity, and quality healthcare and schooling to Black Virginians, seized on the theory of eugenics. The University of Virginia, located in Charlottesville, was a key center for this racist pseudoscience. In 1900, UVA professor Paul Barringer had published what would prove to be one of eugenics' leading treatises, The American Negro, His Past and Future. According to Barringer, Black Americans reached their highest developmental potential under slavery when benevolent white masters imposed selective breeding to improve their savage nature. Barringer argued that after emancipation, Black Americans, quote, return to barbarism is as natural as the return of the sow that is washed to her wallowing in the mire. He did have to admit that at least some Black Americans had exceptional character, since one of his half-brothers, Warren Clay Coleman, born into slavery, founded a successful textile mill and was probably the wealthiest Black man in North Carolina in 1900, the year Barringer published his screed. Barringer believed that Black people were genetically more susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis, and thought the whole race would probably go extinct fairly rapidly. In the meanwhile, though, he believed that Black Americans posed a public health threat to white Americans. For example, tubercular cooks or washerwomen might contaminate the food or clothing of their employers. In the eugenicist irrational system, white Americans, although superior, were somehow surprisingly fragile. Powell, who wrote that essay and adopted these eugenics theories, wrote in this essay that it is not enough to segregate the Negro on railway trains and streetcars, in schools and theaters. It is not enough to restrict his exercise of the voting franchise, so long as the possibility remains of the absorption of Negro blood into our white population. Powell had a proposal to fix this Negro problem. Virginia should issue its citizens racial certificates, punishing misrepresentation as a felony. Then local clerks could scrutinize these certificates before issuing marriage licenses so that no one with, quote, any trace whatsoever of any blood other than the Caucasian could marry a white person. In early 1924, Virginia did indeed pass the frankly named Racial Integrity Act, making only a few changes to Powell's proposal. Dr. Walter A. Plecker, the son of a Confederate veteran and the director of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, was so enthusiastic about his new powers under the act that he even sought to exhume the bodies of people now deemed colored from white cemeteries. Plecker's only disappointment was he didn't have the same resources as the Nazis to enforce eugenics policy, which he explains in what is essentially a fan letter he wrote in 1935 to a Nazi official, praising him for tracking down and sterilizing children fathered by Black French troops stationed in Germany after World War I. The number of marriage licenses denied under the Racial Integrity Act went unreported. We cannot know how many hearts were broken or how many longed-for children went unborn. We do know that the act was still disrupting lives in the early morning of July 11, 1958, when Virginia police burst into the bedroom of Mildred and Richard Loving and arrested them for evading the law by getting married in another state. And it was not until 1967 in Loving v. Virginia that the Supreme Court overturned the Racial Integrity Act and other state prohibitions on interracial marriage, which it had inspired. The Lee statue was unveiled 3 months after the passage of the Racial Integrity Act. To celebrate the statue's arrival, the Klan burned a cross and then marched through the city to the sound of a brass band. Lee was a crucial talking point for the eugenicists, both as they lobbied for the act during the statue's preparation and then afterwards, when they educated Virginians about their new responsibilities. After all, not everyone was happy about the possibility that Plecker might declare them colored after scrutinizing long-forgotten branches of their family tree. So eugenicists pressed Lee into service as an example of what they wanted to achieve. The president of Washington and Lee College praised the general as an embodiment of the great stock of Virginia during the monument's dedication. This stock was an imaginary American race, supposedly descended from the founders of the first colonies. Eugenicists regarded these Americans as even better than white Europeans, since they were both brave enough to cross the sea and hardy enough to survive once they got here. The Lees were one of these first families, tracing their descent to Virginia's earliest settlement. The family's long history of political power and military command could thus be used as evidence that qualities like intelligence and leadership were genetic. As a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Lee claimed in 1934, quote, "It took 5 generations of clean living and wise mating to produce such a man." He insisted that there were not more than 2 or 3 instances when one of Lee's ancestors had married someone not equal in blood. The lack of what he called misalliance made Lee's career, quote, eugenically a lesson in the cumulative effect of generations of wise marriages. Lee himself had actually been obsessed with heredity, although probably not in the way you would expect. His father had followed an early heroic career as one of Washington's Revolutionary War cavalry officers with a descent into speculation and fraud, eventually abandoning his family and fleeing the country. Lee's private writings showed that he considered his life an unceasing fight to resist what he saw as his tainted family heritage. But Charlottesville Lee's statue was meant to teach white viewers to breed wisely and to fear what would happen if they didn't. Lee's role in Virginia's eugenics laws has mostly been forgotten, but it remains a latent toxicity capable of flaring up again. Today's white supremacists would nod along to a lecture by Powell, Barringer, or Plecker. Their talk of white genocide and fears of being replaced are direct echoes of the eugenicist paranoia about white America becoming a Negroid nation. Their attachment to the Lee Monument as a symbol that their attachment to the Lee Monument as a symbol of what they are willing to use violence to defend is the same too. In July 2021, Lee finally left his pedestal in Charlottesville. In December 2021, after considering a number of proposals as to what should happen to the statue, the city council voted to give it to a local African-American heritage nonprofit, the Jefferson School, which had already raised $500,000 to disassemble the statue, melt it down in a foundry, and commission an artist to reuse the bronze for a new piece of public art after consultation with the community. Dr. Andrea Douglas, the Jefferson School's executive director, explained that she wanted the project, dubbed Swords into Plowshares, to be a roadmap for the many other communities deciding what to do about their controversial monuments. But this proposal is currently on hold thanks to another lawsuit. A little more than 2 weeks after the announcement, the City Council and Jefferson School were sued by a group of plaintiffs who want them to weld the broken Lee statue back together. The plaintiffs, who operate Confederate heritage sites, are also seeking damages of $3 million to compensate them for their lost opportunity of acquiring a historic monument. The plaintiffs are different than those in the 2017 Monuments Fund lawsuit, but the legal team working to delay Lee's final surrender is exactly the same. And they aren't alone. Additional lawsuits have been filed seeking reinstallation of 2 other statues taken down in 2020, one honoring Christopher Columbus and another Frank Rizzo, former mayor of Philadelphia who stridently resisted school desegregation. And just days before the Charlottesville suit was filed last December, 2 of the descendants of Vice President John C. Calhoun, who fiercely defended slavery, sued the city of Charleston to prevent it from carrying out its plans to lend the statue of Calhoun it had removed from a downtown square in 2020 to the Los Angeles Contemporary Arts Museum for an exhibition on controversial monuments. Lawsuits like this might seem like doomed rearguard actions, but even if Lee is melted down and Calhoun is trucked to Los Angeles, these suits are warning to other local authorities currently making decisions about what to do with removed monuments. How many officials will now decide to simply give a monument back to a Confederate heritage group rather than risk dealing with a lawsuit brought on by following the wishes of a broader but less litigious public? How many artists or nonprofit organizations will look at the struggles of the Jefferson School to defend itself from multi-million-dollar damages claims and decide not to volunteer to transform a monument? Events like the Unite the Right rally might make you think that fights about US monuments are carried out by crowds of protesters battling to pull up, down, or prop up statues, but the real battle for control over American monuments is fought politely out of public view in courtrooms and municipal offices. If the Lee statue cannot be repaired, the current plaintiffs have asked the court to order its bronze to be recast into Civil War canon for placement on historic battlefields. Rather than wanting to melt swords into plowshares and finally reconcile the divides of the Civil War, they propose to make weapons out of monuments. Too many of our monuments were put up without any public input by people wealthy enough to pay for them at a time when Americans of color had little to no voice in the use of public spaces. Now, as we decide what to do with them, it is not our country's past, but its future at stake. America might not any longer be conceiving itself as a melting pot, but I think it might help us if some of our monuments ended up in one. So, more than happy to answer questions from you or live chat.
Erin, what happened to most of the monuments? Where are
they? So I have a very, took me too long spreadsheet of figuring out exactly where all the monuments I can find have ended up. About 80% of them are still in storage. Undisclosed locations. In that which really ranges. Sometimes it's professional museum grade storage. In Newark, they threw them into a parking lot and put a tarp over them. So it sort of varies, but most of them are people want to think more about their fate, and sometimes in some states like North Carolina, it's required by law that they be re-erected. Sometimes even exactly where they came down from. So people sometimes just don't have any choice. But I think storage is not free, right? We are paying as taxpayers probably more to store these monuments than we did to maintain them on display. That seems maybe not the best use of money. Most of the rest have been given back to private groups, sometimes who donated them, usually like the Daughters of Confederate Veterans, or the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, or various Italian American heritage groups, et cetera, et cetera. And then some have been relocated to historic battlefields or cemeteries, or et cetera, which some people think is a good solution. I like to hang out in historic cemeteries, so not so much for me, but it's probably better than in front of the courthouse.
Erin, this is such an egregious example, the Statue of Lee in Charlottesville, because of its the reasons it was put up, and the maintaining of it, and the size of it, and how in the face of people who were deeply offended by it, it was, but there's so many other examples that, like smaller statues, less prominent, where groups are offended, the murals in San Francisco portraying slavery, all these things, and I just worry about the slippery slope aspect of this. And there's another thing that strikes me, which is that if enough time passes, then no one seems to care. We can look at statues of Nero in one of the worst despots, although I understand his reputation as being racist, in the Met, and no one cares. So it seems like a complicated world you're in.
Yeah, I think a couple of strands there. So I think a lot of the debates that we've been having over monuments have focused on the character of the person represented. You know, was Lee a tragic figure, or a terrible, blah, 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 blah. Like, but I think nobody's perfect. If we said you can only have monuments of perfect people, we'd be smashing all of them. I'm far more interested and investigated for the book the history of the monument as a monument. So especially for Confederate monuments, they almost all went up long after the war, long after the death of who was represented. So I'm interested, what were they put up to do and how they've been used since then. One of the chapters in the book, for example, is on the Confederate monument, the world's largest Confederate monument at Stone Mountain, Georgia, a site where, in association with the monument, the Klan was refounded not once, but twice. And they still want to have cross burnings there. So there's something about that monument that attracts that type of use, and it doesn't seem to me all that great to allow it to keep going. But I'm not the czar of monuments, much as I would like to be. Actually, no, that'd be too much headache. But what I'm really advocating for in the book is to do this type of research to see what monuments have been used for, this particular monument in this community, what the impact it has been and continues to be, and then to have democratic conversations about what the community wishes to do with that monument. All too often, there is either a state law that nails monuments to their pedestals. Was the case in Virginia until 2020, still is the case in many states in the US, or there's just no law or procedure for calling a monument into question. And then people's complaints or desires to discuss just get lost in bureaucratic shuffle. And so it's not surprising to me to see, as we saw in 2020, so many acts of civil disobedience to take down monuments, often by people who had been protesting in the monuments for generations, without any effect. So I don't like it when a monument is nailed to its pedestal by law. I also don't like it when a monument comes down without any discussion as to why that removal is happening or the history it represented, et cetera. I think we need to have these types of conversations to come together as communities to craft a future rather than sort of fixing or erasing out aspects of our past.
Mm-hmm. I've spent a little bit of time in Richmond, which of course has its former Monument Avenue, now Arthur Ashe. And one of the things that struck me when I was there, I think in December, was the pedestals are still all there. Mm-hmm. So the monuments have come down, but the pedestal is there, and numbers of them every couple of blocks, which is its own sort of eerie message that they're, and I don't know whether they're, what the intention is, but there definitely is a message that's conveyed by that. And of course, the one of Lee is covered with lots and lots of very interesting graffiti. So it's become an alternative monument on its own, repurposed, you could say. But whether that's to remain or how you deal with that piece of it, as well as the monument, the statue itself.
Yeah, Richmond is such an interesting case. I think the plan is to remove those pedestals eventually. I think at least one has come down really recently or is beginning to be removed. But I do know that there's finally been some decision as to what to do with the removed monuments. So the Valentine Museum is Richmond's local history museum, and they're planning to display the removed Jefferson Davis statue, but still covered in this like great pink glitter paint that was thrown on him, and the little nicked up, precisely to keep having a conversation about the history, not only of 2020, but the whole process of that statue. So I think that can be very exciting, rather than just like forgetting that, like, oh, a mistake, to use this as an opportunity to have conversations.
I have a question. First, I want to know, on the pedestal, does it say what the statue was?
I didn't get close enough to see.
So I was wondering, so there was a controversy for a while, they were gonna remove the murals of the WPA works. Is that considered monuments, or that's a separate?
And for my book, I looked at things that are outdoors in public space. Also because I think that interior works and murals have a whole other set of issues, especially in schools. So is it a public space? Is it not? And I think the WPA murals, there are several sets of them that have become controversial and are also wonderful works of art. Whereas I have to say that none of the monuments I cover for my book, I would like go to the dock defending them as works of art. There are a lot of that are mass produced. You could buy your Confederate soldier or your Union soldier from the same factory. They just changed like the initials from US to CS for Confederate States on the belt, and then you can put them up in your town. So there's more complicated issues for other statues where the defense that this is a work of art is higher, but I still don't think that's like a no further questions asked if we decide that it's a work of art. Something I've been thinking lately, like if the Mona Lisa gave a shock to every 10th person who saw it, we would take it off display, right? It's harder to measure emotional pain than physical pain, but this is something we have to do, and I think we will continue doing it for a long time. There's many more monuments that deserve a lot closer look in the US than have got so far even. Are there any?
There's some great questions in the live stream. To throw in one, Patron mentions that Lithuania has a place called Stalin World, which is a part of Cold War USSR statuary. That's a new one on me. Do you think there's a possibility of Confederate World?
There is already.
There is already.
Stone Mountain.
Oh, we're back.
Stone Mountain, yeah. You know, people keep mentioning this to me, and I just have a very practical, queer, like, who's gonna go visit like the Museum of Racism? Yeah, it doesn't sound very fun to me, but also that there are a couple of examples actually of former Soviet monuments being trucked into sort of private entrepreneurs have made these statue parks, and some people go to sort of relive their youth, to look at the statues respectfully. Some people will go to contemplate history. Some people go because it's great Instagram opportunity, blah, blah, blah. But I think the historical shift is much more evident in the former Soviet Union than it is currently in the US. We are not at a state yet where we can agree about what these monuments might mean. So the example that I think is much closer is, it's very interesting to talk to people who are running Holocaust remembrance sites or former concentration camps as visitor experiences, because there you have to do it in a way that is respectful, that is true to the past, but also prevents it from being made into a site of martyrdom or celebration, which some people want to use those sites as. So these are problems that we have to think of. It's not just so easy as taking off a pedestal, putting it in a museum. If it's possible that some people are going to celebrate the oppression or see the removed statue as a rallying point for martyrdom. We have one more for the live stream, and then we'll go back to did you have a question?
Yeah. So after reading your book, I used to think there was two sides to every story on these statues. I think there's about 4 or 5. It's a very complex issue. In our own neighborhood, you know, by the mall, which you touched on in Central Park, you know, almost every one of those statues has like 4 or 5 stories that depends on what prism you look through. You know, from the Columbus at the end of the mall to Daniel Webster on 72nd Street. What do you take on those that are like so complex? You know, those are very complex statues versus the Confederate statue.
I'm going to give a talk at Cambridge in May, which I just told them I want to call Schrodinger's past, because I think every time you observe the past in a monument, you come to some different, like you cannot determine what it is until you see how it's being used in the present. So I think that's a key. If it is a monument that is being used to continue to oppress people, that is different than somebody who was a total jerk in his or his lifetime, and now sort of people have forgotten about it entirely. So there is a safety in not examining monuments, but I think it is time to look. Like in Tompkins Square Park, if you go down there, there's a monument to Samuel Cox, and it just says "Friend of the Postman" on it. Because he helped get overtime wages for the U.S. Postal Service. But he is also, as a Northern congressman, he voted against the Emancipation Proclamation for explicitly racist reasons. And is this the greatest work ever to have in the East Village, right? An incredibly diverse neighborhood. I think maybe also not a great work of art. I was actually quoted in the New Yorker today describing it as looking like 3 toddlers in a trench coat. But yeah, I think New York has been sort of oddly silent about a lot of our monuments. There's been focus, right, on Columbus or on the statue of Roosevelt in front of the Natural History Museum, but we have so many that need looking into.
And Marion Sims.
And Marion Sims, yeah. J. Marion Sims.
So speaking of the statue of Roosevelt in front of the American Museum of Natural History, we've got a couple of people in the chat room mentioning that. And somebody says the primary issue it was not his character so much, but the fact that he was portrayed on a horse, whereas the people on either side of him who are Native American and African American are on foot. And I think then there's been some subsequent history after its removal, which was even fairly recent. So can you speak to that whole big picture a little bit?
Right, so this statue of Roosevelt being flanked by, shown as aesthetically inferior people. This triangular composition, not an accident, happens a lot in art to show the sort of the chain of being, as one sculptor that I describe in my book talks about, of inferior and superior races. So Roosevelt is shown as like the culmination of a possible human development, et cetera, has been controversial for a long time. It's interesting in that even when there is not somebody stepping forward to really defend that statue or that person, was also true in the case of J. Marion Sims, the statue that was removed. There's still a very almost like a stoppage, a reluctance to admit that a statue might be harmful, or that we should remove something. But finally, after many years of protest, the statue was removed. And now the plan is to ship it to South Dakota to the Roosevelt Presidential Library and put it on display there at the cost of something like $2 million. So I think last week, the week before, there's a petition published by a lot of people saying, like, why are we taking what is a very sacred land in South Dakota and putting another statue of oppression of Native Americans on it without any consultation with local indigenous people or anybody really besides the people associated with Roosevelt's legacy. So often we think of removal as the end point of these debates, but it really is almost the beginning point of what should happen next. That was it.
Well,
No.
I have a question. It's not really about the monuments, but you just mentioned Roosevelt's descendants or
Well, the people charged with his legacy, which includes the museum, the presidential library, et cetera.
Yeah, so my question is, because you mentioned Calhoun's descendants earlier, but my impression is that Robert E. Lee's descendants are actually a mixed bag, and quite a number of them are quite liberal, and they're thinking fairly enlightened, really critical of their ancestors. Is that part of the part of the outcome. I was really surprised to hear that Calhoun has descendants who are preoccupied with defending him. That actually surprised me because of what I've heard about Robert E. Lee's family.
Yes, there's an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post by one of Lee's descendants saying it's time to take down this statue in Charlottesville. For the Calhoun case, I think it is, I don't know enough to say for sure, but I think it's probably a case of plaintiff finding, like somebody with enough money to pay for this lawsuit is finding somebody with standing. And I think because of the arrangement with the city for the donation of this statue, it's like his descendants have, or in theory, have something to say about it, where the statue ends up. But yes, there's no agreement. Although another big strand of what I tried to do in the book was think about precisely this issue of often these debates get framed as, all right, well, these statues are honoring my ancestors, my Confederate ancestors, etc., my Southern white ancestors, and therefore, like, is it heritage and not hate? Should we leave these up to celebrate that past, and that celebration outweighs any oppressive effects, etc.? So I tried to look in the book to see, do these statues actually, were they put up to honor white Southerners? And often I found that they were put up, especially the statues of low-ranking Confederate soldiers, unnamed soldiers, were put up during periods of labor unrest, during threatened strikes, and in the dedication speeches, the people who paid for these statues, the factory owners, the mine owners, etc., are praising the obedience and self-sacrifice and the listening to their betters of the low-ranking Confederate soldiers, and telling the audience who's listening to them that you should emulate these soldiers, your fathers, your grandfathers, and specifically not agitate for increased wages and not join interracial unionization efforts. That maintaining the color line against the, quote, hideous specter of racial equity, as was talked about in the dedication speech of the Birmingham Confederate Monument, was more important than advocating for a living wage. So one chapter is on Birmingham. The Confederate Monument there was put up actually in two parts, almost 10 years apart, the base and then the obelisk shaft, both explicitly in reaction to strikes of area mine workers. So I think that digging into this history can disrupt this idea of like who should be in favor of these statues and who should be the one most affected by them.
Question?
I read your book, congratulate you very much on it because I got a lot out of it. It was very concise and informative, amazing, informative. And your notes, 544 notes. 544 notes in a less than 300-page book. I thought it was incredible.
Oh, praising my footnotes, you know the way of my heart.
The notes were so informative. The notes were so informative. But I disagree with you on getting rid of the statues, because when you do that, you're erasing their history. And you're putting them in places where people aren't going to go see them. They're hidden. And that is American history. That's American history, whether we like it or don't like it or say it's not true, etc. So I would suggest, my suggestion is to put another statue with an opposite view next to it, be it of any person, black, white, or otherwise. But I'm very much opposed to erasing that history and hiding it. Because it's the truth. It's the truth.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to hide anything, and I want to figure out what the best way to not hide that history is.
But when they put it in places that people aren't going to go to, cemeteries and places like that, you know,
Yeah.
it's really hidden.
What's the use?
So as a lot of people say, you gotta open it up, you gotta open this history. It hurts to talk about it, but you have to, and you have to tell what was happening on both sides, whether you like it or not. I think that's the only way we're going to advance racially in this society.
And you know. But for the rest of you, one person in the book or one institution I profile is the Houston Museum of African American Culture, who has what seems like a very similar view of you shouldn't totally get rid of these monuments because you can use them to make clear what the history has been. So they are the only African American institution so far to have taken in, to rehome a Confederate monument, and they have put it on view and have been commissioning artists to make works reacting to the statue. Exactly because the CEO who I talked to, John Guest Jr., said that he wants to take advantage of the emotional pull of the statue. It's beautiful. It's this like really buff young guy wearing only palm fronds with wings. He looks great. You're like, oh, that's beautiful. Oh, wait, what do you represent? So he wants to take advantage to sort of boomerang your reaction as an audience to realizing the courage of people who stood up to this statue and what it represented, who advocated for civil rights in Houston from I think it went up in the 20s onward under the gaze of this statue. So yeah, I think there are all sorts of, there's so many creative potentials for use of these statues.
And the truth, I was just reading somewhere and they called Thomas Jefferson a pedophile rapist. Now if that was put on the statue, yeah, makes you think.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that works to counter the statues with?
I think that's our best chance because so our brains just react differently to images than they do to text. So I think that most people's proposal is to say, let's put up a sign explaining the history. Signs don't do anything. That comes into you in a different way than the image. And in the book, I described the research of Laura Jane Smith, who's a professor in Australia who spent like 15 years surveying visitors to historical sites that attempt to do this, including historical mansions and plantations in the US that attempt to say, look, Jefferson, including owned people. How could someone who wrote all men are created equal have owned over 600 people in his lifetime? And she found that people are extremely good at ignoring any information that would make them feel cognitive dissonance, that would make them think something that they don't want to believe. So people came out saying like, oh yeah, Jefferson was so great. He gave enslaved people a chance. Yeah, it didn't even have to work on Sundays. Like that is not what the curators wanted you to think. But if you can challenge an image with an image, I think that's better, but it is also extremely expensive to do so. So I hope that will happen. I don't think it's gonna happen that often just because of the expense.
I just have one other question, if I may. As I was reading it, I was wondering, what made you write this book, and I saw on page 178, so I wrote this book to uncover stories like this, stories to startle us out of our assumptions. Could you just say a little more about why you actually write this book?
Yeah, so I saw a statue of an activist named Mike Forcha organizing the toppling of a statue of Columbus saw a statue, did I just say? I saw a video in the summer of 2020. And I tweeted something about it and the tweet went viral because I had it, I wrote it after I had a cocktail, not a good idea to drink and tweet. I ended up like on Tucker Carlson, who said that I was teaching my students, like I was leading armies of nihilists to take down statues. And like the only nihilists I know are my kids and I can't even get them to pay attention about bedtime. So definitely not leading armies of nihilists. But what was really interesting to me was there were thousands of comments on this tweet and they said things that I didn't realize were in question. Like, what's wrong so bad about Columbus? Or, Americans have never taken down statues. And I thought, all right, there's an opportunity for telling some people who are not those people who have known for a long time the problems of oppression of these monuments, about this from my perspective, or from my privilege, so to speak, as a tenured professor. Like, I can say these things, and people will pay attention and maybe put me on Tucker Carlson, but not fire me. So why not? And it gave me a chance to amplify a lot of work that's already been being done. And I was really surprised. Like, I end up, there's a chapter in the book about Mike Forcha. I interviewed him, and it was the first time that he had been interviewed at length about this act. He had extremely fascinating things to say about what motivated him to do this, what motivated him to potentially gain a criminal record, potentially have heavy financial penalties, when he had been a really direct action person before. He was helping the unhoused, he was helping elders, he was advocating for Indigenous issues, and so what did he care about a chunk of stone? And so there are many, many news reports on his toppling, but they all assume they knew what he was motivated by without really asking him. So I am very proud in the book that I got to talk to people like him, like John Guess at the Houston Museum, like Mayor Randall Woodfin in Birmingham, and sort of take the space to tell their stories in a broader way than just in a news flash.
Aaron, what surprised you when you were doing this research? Was there anything that you found completely unexpected?
What didn't surprise me? I only put in things that surprised me into the book. So
Okay.
this is Sarah was I was living with her during pandemic while I wrote the book. So every day I would come down for lunch and be like, "Can you believe this?" And she put up with many of my stories.
I was just going back to the prior question. I was thinking about maybe that the purpose of leaving the pedestal could be you're not leaving the object up, much of which you said is, it's offensive to a lot of people, but it's also not great art, and there's no reason to keep it up, and there's no reason to fetishize it. But the pedestal itself says something was here, and we need to talk about what was here. So that might be the monument to say, this is the talking point. This is the, that, I don't know. I mean, it's,
Yeah, I think so.
I agree that the monuments themselves, I don't see any reason to keep them, if they are offensive to people and they are, and they're not great works of art either, then, what is the purpose of having them there? You want to teach people about why it's not there, but that's not doing it, having it still be there, because you're still focused on the object.
Yeah, the plan to remove the pedestals in Richmond is pretty distressing to me, because I do think they are beautiful now. And the one of Lee has remained with a lot of its additions and modifications. The others have been scrubbed. And then sometimes there's repainting happening, but there's a real Law and Order tendency to we can't possibly have any evidence of public disagreement about these statues left up. Even though the Roosevelt statue was splashed with red paint a couple weeks before it was scheduled to be removed, and they immediately, before the daybreak, had scrubbed off that paint. So monuments, it's sort of not surprising, right? Monuments are supposed to be about communal values. So the idea that some people don't ascribe to those values, or the values as embodied in the monument, is disturbing. It shows the rifts, but sometimes that you gotta see into the depths of the rift before you know how to heal it.
I think maybe one or two more questions, if that's good for you. A lot of us in this neighborhood were excited when in mid-2020, I just double-checked its name, the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument went up in Central Park. And a lot of us, including me, learned for the first time that was the first statue of historic women in Central Park. Lots and lots of men, at least one fictional female person, Alice in Wonderland, but no historic women until then, which is a huge shift. Can you talk a little bit about National View gender balance among statues. I suspect there are many more men. But also what's happening now in a positive sense, we talked about new art responding to previous art, but just generally to enhance public art and to enhance inclusion of subjects in public art.
Right, the monuments lab just did a monuments survey and looked at gender, racial, et cetera, balance in monuments across the US. Unsurprisingly, very few women, but even in places you would expect, like Congress, minuscule amounts of statues of actual women who lived, as opposed to Alice in Wonderland and Juliet's, who are in Central Park, et cetera. So I think often there's this idea of like, let's put more and we'll fix the balance. The people who put up, the organization founded to put up this women's rights monument in Central Park referred to it as breaking the bronze ceiling, to have actual women in the park. I am a little more skeptical of the idea that once we take down the particular dude from the horse, we just put somebody else up on the horse. And sort of, I think it would be much more interesting to really challenge the idea of what a monument is for, which I take inspiration from. There's a book written in 1916 by Freedman F.M. Murray, who is a DC Black activist and journalist who decided to look at all the representations of Black people he could find in public art in America. There are not many. And to look at the sort of the hidden stereotypes, or not that hidden stereotypes, that were embodied by these images. And he also wrote at the end of this book about, well, what could we do better? What could we do next? And his idea was not, let's just put up more diverse people in these monuments. His idea was, well, look, you're never going to be able to represent the full scope of American diversity, no matter how many people you cram into a monument. He advocated for allegorical figures. But I think while that's still a possibility, there's also the idea of abstract monuments, which aren't traditional, which aren't figural, but where I think are more freeing to the imagination, are more inspiring. So instead of seeing yourself or not seeing yourself literally, you can feel inspired. Some of my favorite recent monuments have been, there's a corkboard in the shape of a horse that went up in the Brooklyn Museum for a bit, called The Commons, where viewers were invited to pin on pieces of paper with little messages. So it was like a public message board in the form of a monument. That artist also recently in a park in Queens installed a monument that is in the form of sort of monumental barbecue grills with things written on them, with the idea of like, people are going to come and have fun and grill for each other, so why not give them something that they can do that on, and also sort of prompt them to think about rights and what America means, etc. So I, again, not in charge of all monuments in America, nor would I want to be, but I think if Murray had this idea in 1916, it might be time to hop on that idea, not just, swap out the rider, but rethink monuments entirely.
Actually, the Vietnam Memorial.
Yes, exactly. We know how to do it. It's possible. We don't need the horse.
I like that as the title.
Next book. Don't need the horse.
Don't need the horse. Right.
One more question in the live stream, and then if there's anything else you'd like to add or toss in, that would be great. Forgive me, I'm going to summarize this just a little bit. You mentioning the statue of Theodore Roosevelt at the AMNH, and that the problem is the elevation of him above the other two figures. Paper points out that in the famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, he's elevated among the, when is that elevation potentially a good thing? When is it a problematic thing? Can you speak to that a little bit? Are there any statues where it's a good thing? Is it always?
So sometimes a triangle is just a triangle. But in many statues, like the Roosevelt statue, or this statue by Horatio Greenough that I talk about in the book, showing a settler killing a Native American warrior, that also uses this triangular composition. there's this idea that it's not possible for the people at the bottom of the triangle to rise. Like if people crossing the Delaware chose to stand up and be as silly as Washington standing up in a boat, don't do that. They would be the same height. There's nothing to prevent their rise, but there's a lot of hierarchical statuary that's telling people what their place is. And that's not always racial. So this is my argument for a lot of the Confederate monuments, that they are telling working class people what your place is obedience to your betters. And just to close, to add, I want to encourage everybody to make their voice heard, because I think this is a really exciting moment for monuments, actually, to defend, to protest, to propose new things. Nobody in authority has any idea of what the best thing to do is. So they are desperate for suggestions. So now is the time to make those suggestions, whether on the public streets, whether inside the museums, what's on display, how it's kept or repatriated or described. I think the people who love arts should feel responsibility to make sure that love is helping everybody be better and not secretly or not so secretly harming some. So thank you very much for